So, welcome everybody. Thank you all very much for coming along, for those who are here in person and those who are also watching online as well. So this is an event which is in part hosted by Keel's Institute for Sustainable Futures, which aims to bring together different disciplines and non-academic actors to make a real difference to the sustainability challenges we face. And tonight's panel is a really good example of bringing those different perspectives together. And I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation around a very little discussed area and the sustainability impacts of conflict. So, as a way of a bit of background, this panel discussion is inspired by the work of the artist Ali Lockhead, who is on the panel tonight, and her exhibition Art for Peace, which is being installed at a couple of venues at Keel and in Newcastle Town Centre, and is going to be available for viewing over the next few weeks, and I'll give you some more details of that at the end. The exhibition is also timed to coincide with Refugee Week towards the end of June, and also this event to coincide with the SU's Refugee Week, and they've been out in force today. And linked with that, it's a real delight to welcome Godfroy Samaniga from ASHA, which is an organisation that promotes social inclusion for asylum seekers and refugees in North Staffordshire as well, on our panel tonight. So, sustainability is one of those unhelpful terms. It's understood by different people in different ways. I think what's really important to say here is that we're not just talking about environmental sustainability. So we're really using the UN Sustainable Development Goals to frame what we mean by sustainability in these discussions. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, with 169 different targets behind them, and they're really a roadmap for a more sustainable future, ranging from no poverty, no hunger, to gender equality, decent work and economic growth, to climate action. All of those issues are interlinked. And we can't consider just environmental sustainability without the social and economic sustainability too. So that's our framing for the use of the term sustainability today. And of course, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is specifically peace, justice, and strong institutions, which really highlights this link between sustainability and conflict, and is particularly pertinent to this evening's discussions. So, in terms of the format of this session, we're going to have brief introductions from each speaker. I'll let them do that themselves rather than me terribly misrepresent them. Then I'm going to pose some questions to each panellist in turn. We'll have some general questions that any panellist can jump in on, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience as well, hopefully. So, without further ado, I will pass over to the panellists to introduce themselves, and we'll go in the order they're sat in. So over to you, Cliff.
Thanks, Zoe. Hello, everyone. I'm Clifford Stott. I'm a professor of social psychology in the School of Psychology here at Keel. And my research interests revolve around the social psychological dynamics of collective conflict or collective violence. So I have a long-standing interest in studying, in specific terms, the dynamics of riots. You know, why do people riot? Why do people come into conflict collectively in the context of crowd events? But as that work's grown and developed, we increasingly started to ask questions around how people behave collectively in other areas, such as mass emergencies. So, for example, at the moment we're doing a project looking at how people behave in the context of, for example, a marauding terrorist attack. Also then, my interest also spheres into how the authorities, in particular the police, approach the management of collective conflict, because through our research we've begun to recognise there's an intersectionality between those things. Often collective violence in crowds grows out of the attempt by the authorities to prevent that collective violence as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's my background and interest.
Thanks. Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Zoe. So I'm a reader in geosciences here at Keele University. So I do a variety of mostly outdoor-based investigations, often looking for search, looking for things of interest in the geotechnical world, so the boring things, looking at buried utilities. But in this aspect, I guess, it's looking at the environmental legacy on battlefield sites, and that's everything from looking at training grounds to, sadly, conflicts and their sort of damage to infrastructure. How's that going to affect the area around those, as well as possible reconstruction and that side of things. So I think that's what you're keen on me talking about tonight.
Thanks, Jim. Tom?
Yeah, so I'm Tom Gilbert-Newell, and I'm a graduate now in Environment and Sustainability here at Kiel, and I'm the current elected Activities and Community Officer at Kiel Students' Union. And of course, with my degree, I've always been interested in sustainability and the environment, especially the 3 pillars, which we have learned so extensively through my degree with Zoe and Jamie as well, and how we can work to create a better future for myself and people who are younger than me as well, so that way we can have a planet.
Thanks. Ali?
Hi, I'm an artist and also a peace activist. So a bit of my background, I suppose, I mean, ever since I was a child, I wanted to be an artist, but also from a very early age I'd be outraged about social injustices, and I would join in with the anti-Vietnam War, demonstrations and things. I think I was about 15, something like that at that time. And so it's gone on. So sadly, one still has to be very strong out there, waving banners and basically saying, down with this sort of thing, we've had enough. It just goes on and on and on. I've also, as I was saying before, art doesn't earn an income for anybody. So I had a job, my sort of paid job. I worked as an independent, consultant, I suppose, for international development. So I've traveled worldwide, and it would be specifically around access to justice for women. I'm saying this because it sort of puts my work in some context. But it would often be in post-conflict zones, working in internally displaced camps, you name it. But around the whole thing of access to justice for women, there'd be just constant conflict and constant lack of being able to be in a peaceful environment, because the communities within themselves would always be in total tension. It's hard to explain in a way, but yes. So my work, really, I'd be working globally, coming back, and so I would put all my feelings into my art. I'm really a sculptor, I suppose, so doing it from there. But that was my way of expressing how I felt about what was going on in the world, and that would be linked with the conflicts that were going, the actual, sort of war conflicts that were going on. But it would be the conflicts, within communities, within the world, within political oppressions, you name it, and it seems to get worse and worse as we go on. So I think we'll be talking about other things within, but that's really where I'm coming from. So my work is about how I feel about it, and then it's for interpretation by others, what they see in it. But it's trying to raise some awareness around the horrors of it all and the stupidity of it all.
Thanks, Ali, and we'll ask you to go into some more detail on all of that in a bit. Emma?
Yeah, so I'm Emma Allen. I'm a lecturer here at the School of Law within the university. Thinking about how my research intersects with the sort of themes that we're discussing today, I suppose mine sits really at the boundary between climate change and conflict. So essentially climate change as a kind of driver of conflict. Specifically, I've spent quite a period of time now, since about 2014, researching a group of about 32 small low-lying island nations located in the South Pacific, but also the Indian Oceans, that stand to be completely inundated, completely submerged by climate change-induced rising sea levels. And this will happen in the next sort of 50 to 100 year time span. We're much nearer now the 50-year time span. And essentially this sort of existential threat that these small island nations are facing stands in a whole plethora of ways, plethora of respects, to lead to potential conflict situations. So hopefully there's something in that can be unpacked as part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Emma. And Godfrey.
Thank you. My name is Godfrey Seminega. I'm from a local charity called Ashan Ostafsha. We support people victims of conflict, asylum seekers, refugees. Those are people from over 50 different nationalities. So we support people from Syria, from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and recently we have started getting more people from Ukraine. We do support people from Libya, Ethiopia, and Iran. So we provide them holistic support to meet their needs, such as emotional support, decision support, language support, to help them to integrate in local community.
Super, thank you very much. So that is our panel for this evening. Really sort of diverse, different sort of perspectives. So I'm really excited by what everyone has to say and how that might all interact. But let's start off with you, Ali. This whole event is due to your exhibition. So could you sort of explore a bit more about how the themes of sustainability and conflict are represented in your work, both generally, but also for the work being exhibited here in Kiel as well, as a little helpful sort of plug for people to also go and see your exhibits here and in Newcastle.
Yes, I'm not sure that actually sustainability is represented in the work as such. I mean, for me, it's really important that the work raises awareness around issues around the impact of war. So all the different vast array of impacts, and it's been talked about, on the impact of the land, the long-term impacts, to individuals, to communities, to education, to right across the board. So although I'm not specifically in any painting saying this is what I'm trying to tell you. I'm not trying to tell anybody anything with it, but I'm hoping it raises those questions. And because for me, things like the military, right across the world, I mean, it's never discussed in terms of, in any of the climate change talks, in the Kyoto Protocol in 97, the USA very effectively just took it off the agenda and it's never ever gone back. So the military, the impact of the military is not part of any discussions around the impacts for sustainability and future. And it's vast, the impact is vast. And that will be, talked about in all of these ways, just the nuclear stuff that goes on in the islands and you name it. So although I'm not actually saying that, I'm hoping that the work gets people questioning these things and, by doing exhibitions like this, having, these sorts of discussions, raising awareness, so people do start to ask, well, why not? And actually it has to be. It has to be talked about. It's, it's this huge elephant in the room, and it is silenced very, very effectively by the powers to be, and it's got to be unsilenced. So, yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I think they are two sort of, sustainability and conflict. There are such clear sort of implications there, but it is just not a conversation which is usually being had. So thank you for making us have that conversation and for promoting those thoughts in your work. If we can move now to you, Cliff, and you talked a bit about your research around things like sort of social identity, different issues around security. What can you say about sort of how your research can really help us understand the problems and the solutions which are maybe associated with the impacts of movements of people, whether that's from conflict situations themselves or from climate change related migration, which might also lead to conflict situations?
Yeah, I can try. I think that any conversation about any potential solutions has to flow from an analysis of the problems that we're going to have to confront. And I think one of the things that we have to start to recognise is that the future for humanity on this planet revolves around our capacity to drive rapid social change. So if you think the level of change that we as societies are going to have to go through over the next 30 years is going to outstrip to an unprecedented level the kinds of social change we went through in the Industrial Revolution, and that was stretched over hundreds of years. We've got to condense that into 30 years. Now, there's no doubt that in that process of social change, conflict is going to be central. It's going to be central in various different ways, partly because that social change is going to disrupt the power and the vested interests of those who currently possess it. And it's also going to create lots of disruption. So I think we're going to see conflict revolving around those dynamics. And I think from my work, it's about understanding how those dynamics operate. And the threat that we're looking at here is a threat to one of the themes of the Institute for Sustainable Futures, which talks to us about this idea of sustainable governance. Well, what do we mean by sustainable governance? Well, I think in part what we mean is our capacity to sustain the kind of governance that we enjoy now, which revolves around this idea of some form of democracy, some form of freedoms. And we are already beginning to see those forms of governance under challenge. And they're under challenge in part because of many of the issues that we're focused on in our discussion already. So if we think, first of all, what's going to happen in relationship to your issues around these islands, which really are a microcosm, a case study of what's going to be happening across the planet that we're just kind of not wising up to at the moment. I mean, look at the news at the moment around the temperatures in India that are having a dramatic impact on people's capacities to live in those areas. Well, that's not really affecting us very much at the moment in the same way. So what we are going to see is areas that are radically affected and areas that are more protected. And what we're going to see is a turn towards a form of securitized government that is designed to protect the self-interests of those who are not immediately a threat. And we've already seen that with Trump, haven't we? Build a wall. Well, that kind of agenda is just going to become more and more acute. And it's going to be driven by an increase in the migration that's going to be forced through climate change. And we've seen that in so many different ways where, the borders of our protected environment are going to become points of conflict. But we're also going to see conflict internally to our societies by people who are disenfranchised by the social change, but also people who are angered by the lack of social change. And then there's an agenda that's emerging here in our forms of governance that relate to our freedoms to do that. Look at what's happening in the UK. We've got forms of law coming into being that's going to make it illegal to be disruptive in a protest. That's not democracy. That's called totalitarianism, right? So what we're seeing is a slide towards securitized governance that is built around a politic that we call the politics of identity. But what do we mean by that politic of identity, other than the sense of who we are is different from who they are? And who are they? Well, they're the people who populate places like India, places like these islands, places where communities are different to us in ethnic terms. So we're going to start seeing a racialized, securitized agenda coming to the fore, in which conflict is a key dynamic, a key component, and I would argue even actively promoted by some people to secure their vested interests. And those challenges are going to be immense across the next 30 years. And unless we start to theorize about them, unless we start to understand them, unless we start to locate our awareness, this idea of your art as a vehicle to create awareness, unless we start to use the universities, the platforms that we have to create the kind of awareness that we need to take forward, we are going to be subjected to this securitized environment by the time we get to that end of the 30 years. And what we also, if I may just to conclude, is that within that we have to see that there are some central concepts. And for me, one of those concepts is security. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, for me, it really brings home how central security is to our understanding of the way forward and what we need to understand. So we've got this thing going on, which is a war between nation states, Ukraine and Russia, which traditionally would be understood in terms of state security. But that war in and of itself is creating an environment of food insecurity and also issues around poverty and the cost of living crisis, as it's called, because of this amplification of costs that goes alongside war. So all this kind of ways of understanding what's going on can be theorized through this concept of security. And that's why I think it has to be so central to any debate about sustainability moving forward. Because if we are going to create sustainable lifestyles, it's clear that we need to address the issue of conflict and understand how to navigate through social change without amplifying it towards forms of securitized society that equate to totalitarianism.
I can see why I invited you to be on this panel now, Cliff. Fantastic response, and a huge amount of issues within there, and so articulately sort of put about actually the importance of addressing these issues. You referenced Emma's work, so let's move on to Emma, and with reference to your work on territorial loss on low-lying small island nations. Can you say something about how you think these impacts can be managed from a legal perspective to avoid conflict, to maybe sort of respond to some of the comments from Cliff as well?
Yeah, so I think from what has already been said, quite a lot of the work I do definitely sort of intersects and feeds into that. And I think a couple of points, perhaps the good starting point for me, is that in finding solutions for the problems faced by these small islands, I think you have to sort of first and foremost, but at least in a sort of complementary way, you have to look at the problem. So the root cause of what they are facing, as I've said, is climate change. This is a driver of the sea level rise that is causing the loss of their land. So the first port of call for lawyers, it's, perhaps becoming more of a lost cause as time is progressing and we're seeing that things aren't moving as fast as we would like, is to try and have some kind of mitigating effect on climate change. So look to encourage these nation states to reduce the level that they're emitting, help states in need, such as these developing small islands, to adapt. And we've had mentioned, I know, Ali, you mentioned about the Kyoto Protocol. We also have the United Nations framework on climate change. And we also have most recently the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm sure you'll have seen when we have the sort of regular conferences related to these international treaties that should be promoting real forward progress, as we're sort of seeing from the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which really reports on the climate science, year on year, just the situation is becoming more and more dire. Now, I think some cause for hope, I would say, on the climate change front is definitely not a lost cause, and I think the cause for hope we actually find in domestic courts, because we are actually finding that there is the will on the part of individuals and also sort of civil society groups to actually try and hold states accountable to meet these emissions targets, and also corporations that are emitting in domestic courts. Nevertheless, this doesn't eradicate the fact that there are some countries, such as the small island states that I research, who are facing loss and damage as a result of the fact that we aren't adequately dealing with climate change. So this means that another prong of attack, I suppose, for us as international lawyers, people like me, is to try and look at solutions for these islands, ways that we can interpret the law innovatively to try and ensure that the situation is a little bit less dire for them than we can see it quite clearly is. And there are, I suppose, three three key areas that we are focusing attention as regards these island states at the present time, but it's been for a short while now. The first is related to the sort of law of the sea, that kind of area, because of the fact that from a legal perspective, we have not a particularly nuanced idea that in order to have sovereignty or ownership of maritime resources, which these island states have a wealth of, you have to have some kind of land territory. So they stand to lose ginormous amounts of maritime space, which, as you can imagine, could lead to conflict as there's the land grab by more developed states. We also then have, as the territory becomes increasingly uninhabitable and completely inundated, issues of climate change migration that have already been touched upon. And the questions of sort of moving these islanders that have a real sense of attachment to where they are currently based to other countries that have actually shown themselves to not really even want them, that is promoting conflict situations in that way as well. And then finally, at the sort of the worst case scenario, when the territory is completely lost, we need to look at questions of sort of statehood. How do we deal as lawyers with this idea that a state has physically and legally disappeared off the map? Now, because of the fact that these island states, as has been raised, are essentially the sort of canaries in the coal mine, we're an island here in the UK, so this could be something that we face in the not, well, distant future, but it's a possibility. It's an unprecedented situation, so at the moment there are a lot of sort of gaps in the law, and it's very uncertain how we should be dealing with this. There is, I would say, cause for hope, though, because these island states and groups of lawyers, bodies of lawyers that I work with, really are trying to sort of innovatively push and develop the law for solutions to these kinds of issues. So.
It's great to hear a positive note.
Yeah, try and end on a positive.
Because, you know, we've seen with sort of recent announcements, you know, the chance of us, you know, staying within 1.5 degrees C, warming increase, you know, is pretty much gone. And that was the target that those small island states were insisting on because they are at the front line. But it's really useful to hear that there is actually, you know, some little glimmers of hope there in terms of the legal response to it. So thanks for that Emma. I'm going to move to you, Jamie, to sort of pick up on maybe a slightly sort of different element, which is really sort of thinking more about the environmental sort of impacts that we might be seeing sort of long-term from conflict. So, you know, where have your diverse research interests, but including sort of military geology, you know, what could you say about those sort of long-lasting physical impacts and signatures of conflict that we can still see years on?
Thanks, Zoe. And it sounds less exciting, perhaps, but the sort of nuts and bolts of conflicts are quite important. And you're thinking from everything from the raw materials that are required. So again, you're thinking about logistical and supply issues. So where's your uranium that you're going to be mining to tip onto your shells, which they're going to use in a conflict, and then where are those uranium spots from their shell impacts is going to have long-lasting effects for those soil things. So those are sort of prosaic stuff, as well as you're thinking about training. So you've got an army, you're training things. Again, your training sites are going to be contaminated. You might be, I don't know, contaminating the water supply, perhaps. There's a few papers that have worked on that at the Little Bighorn field site in America, for example. The actual conflict sites themselves, of course, you see in most of the modern conflicts destroyed infrastructure, and you see the big buildings, people who live in it. Obviously, that's tragic. But you also think not maybe so aware of the utilities. You've got gas. You've got destroyed petrol stations. Again, those tanks have a lot of petrol in them. So where's that going to go? And then that's going to be residing around. Those hydrocarbons going to be left in the soil. So those are big issues, as well as temporary depot sites, maybe people doing temporary water extraction for troops. So there's all those sort of slightly less exciting things, but they're going to have a long-lasting effect on those sites. We see those digging in around Chernobyl, around the soil, the contamination and getting radioactive exposure. So all of those sort of aspects are going to have a big impact on both the local population, the regional one as well, and then obviously whoever the national country is, how they're going to resolve those issues. Some of them can be relatively straightforward. There's a lot of work on detecting and characterising contaminated land. That's something that in the UK we're quite good at. We've had a long industrial history, lots of past usage of land, and then how, what are the main issues and how are we going to at least detect them, if not remediate them. That's obviously the next stage. But that is quite a long-lasting effect, I would say, if that's what you were after, theory.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jamie. And I think, really interesting to sort of pick up on both that resource use as well as that sort of contamination legacy. And then, of course, the emissions just associated with conflict as well. And I'm sure there must be studies sort of out there in terms of what the emissions, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of conflict as well, that I really should have looked up for this. Super. If I can move now over to you, Godfrey. And, in your organisation, you must hear stories of the impacts of conflict on people's lives all of the time. And, I wonder if you could just sort of reflect on what are the biggest long-term impacts that you really sort of see, that the people that you're working with, and what can be done to reduce those impacts on those who are directly affected by conflict.
Well, the most issue which asylum seekers and refugees are facing, they lost social identity. They suffer from mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder. They live in destitution. Asylum seekers are not allowed to work in this country. And if they still have support from the government, they'll get £39 something for a week to buy everything, food, clothes, buy bus pass. If stock is one day city where public transport is very expensive. They live in very extreme social isolation. They lost friends, families, parents, brothers and sisters. They are not living in an environment where they grow up. They are new city where they know nobody. They don't know, they live in limbo, They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow because they have to put an application to Home Office to assess the application and to grant them refugee status. And, there's this politics of hostile environment for migration, which has big impact on asylum seekers and refugees. When you talk destitution, some people think it's just money or something. Social identity is very, very vague and very big area. You support someone from Syria. He had a big business in his country, and he lost them in one day. And he had to travel to the UK. And he has to come to our charity to queue up on rain in Mines 5, outside in the car park, to beg for refused food from a supermarket. Can you imagine someone who's, I'm not saying billionaire, but very wealthy in this country and coming begging to survive for a bread, or to come to beg for £5 for transport? So that's how they lose social identity. I guess, what can we do? Obviously, is to avoid conflict around the world. We need to fight and make sure that we live in a society, in a peaceful society where everyone respects each other, where you got strong institutions and strong government. We live in a social society where there's democracy. And I think some of the people who did say something, they did mention about climate change and the conflict. We forgot that some people leave their country because of impact of climate change. I've seen this in East Africa when there was an issue of rain and there's nothing, there's no food, so people have to move to another country to seek asylum for that. So that's what we need to do. We need to avoid conflict. We need to make sure we live in a very peaceful society, and a fair society as well in terms of democracy and human rights. I believe that when you look at how asylum seekers living, they come here with a trauma, and the trauma affects women, children, and men, everyone. And then they arrive in a society where they don't know anyone, and they have to face an hostile environment where they now have to challenge the government policies, which really doesn't give any kind of chance to integrate in local communities. So we try to help them to meet those day-to-day needs in terms of languages, in terms of destitution by giving some food, social integration, doing some activities in community, doing some voluntary work in local communities so they can interact with local people, they can understand the society where they are. We refer them to different communities where they can probably enjoy their culture, they can enjoy religion, things like that. So we can do many things, the campaign, political campaign. We had this nationality bill who passed, I think 2 weeks ago. We did a very strong campaign against that because that's part of a hostile environment. Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks very much, and thanks for bringing those real experiences to us, and I think it's really important that we hear those real experiences. But equally, really interesting in terms of what you're saying. We see the links between what everyone else has been discussing, and that hostile environment for refugees just fits with that idea of this sort of more securitized sort of governance that we see, and those issues around social identity. So we can, as well as that lived experience, see those sort of theoretical links as well. So Tom, let's sort of moving to thinking about the university, the Students' Union. Could you tell us a bit about what the Students' Union does to support students whose lives might have been touched by conflicts in different ways? And also maybe what you'd like to see more of happening within the Students' Union.
Yeah, I'll definitely get into that second one as well. But especially recently, as the activities and community officer, I try to bridge that gap between our students, the local community, and the international community as well. And it's a difficult job to do. There's a lot of people, but very recently, students have been very inspiring to me. The amount of projects and ideas that have come from students, especially students who have come from a lot of these crises, it's been inspiring to see the work they want to do and the work they have done to support others within these crises and students here. As Kiel, we're an international institution. We've got people from all over the world, and we've got students and staff who come from different crises around the world. And as an institution and as a students' union, we should be supporting them. Most recently, I had a student come up to me right after the start of the Ukrainian crisis, and she wanted to start a donation scheme for students to get involved with and donate, so we could send these donations from first aid kits to sleeping gear and coats, and send them off to the Polish-Ukrainian border to support people who have been affected by the crisis. And we started this thinking, some students will donate a couple items. It ended up getting into the local community, and by the second day, we had thousands and thousands of donations coming into the SU. And of course, we weren't prepared for this, being a small charity on Kiel campus, receiving thousands of donations from a local Asda shop who came with 3 carfuls of donations from the local community, from primary schools coming together and bringing their full school buses worth of donations. It was an amazing experience to see both the Kiel community, the local community, students and staff all come together to support these people. And I'm happy to say that they've now been sent off. But projects like these that students bring to us, we help them and support them to make it happen, to make it reality. And that's stuff that I want to continue doing. And that's what really inspires me, because this isn't something I came up with. That was a student that contacted me on a Friday afternoon. Luckily, I was still in work at 6 p.m. And it happened over the weekend, and then we opened the donation scheme on Monday. You know, this is stuff that it's a student movement, and that's what inspires me. And we continue to do work like that, such as today with the Art for Peace Gallery, with the Refugee Festival that we held today, with 3 student societies raising £365 for the Zara Trust and Asha, and through doing different activities and selling food, and the student and staff that got involved with that, from buying products to talking to Asha and the other organizations that came. It's amazing to see the community that we've put together to support each other. And to answer your second question, what I'd like to see more of, which I'll be definitely working on more next year and over the summer, is expanding our support for students and staff who have come from places of crisis. Currently, we really only have a lot of support information about Ukraine, but expanding that to crises around the world, not only just Ukraine, but Lebanon, Syria, most currently as well Afghanistan, making sure that we're not just supporting one group of students, but all of our students through the work we do as a students' union and a university. And I really want to expand on that, because we don't only have Ukrainian students, we have students from all around the world, and we're here to support them. And that's what I want to work on. And I can't wait to work with students and the university to continue the great work we've been doing, and to make it even more impactful. So yeah.
Thanks, Tom. And I think, another real glimmer of hope there in terms of, that sort of activity, that action being taken by our students. And certainly, the work that I've done with students around sort of sustainability, sort of activism, is very much, never say no, because if we also support students to make their ideas happen, they feel empowered and they have the agency to do more when they leave university as well. So it's, fantastic stories to hear there. So thank you all, for your individual sort of perspectives. I'll just throw out a question that anyone can sort of pick up before we then go to the audience for any questions. And so, throughout all your excellent sort of contributions, we've talked about lots of different aspects of sustainability in relation to conflict. But is there anything that you think that we haven't sort of considered here? Or are there new synergies or ideas that have sort of emerged for you from listening to some of the other sort of perspectives and approaches? So you can sort of take that question in a couple of different ways.
Maybe
go for it,
I'll
Ali.
respond with a few things, but whether it's directly about that. But for me, just hearing particularly both of you speak, these are issues that have been only actually very, very recently coming out of, say, an institution, or, coming into more the public domain. As an example, in COP26, when they're talking about, again, I'm going to just talk military missions for the moment, but, it was like even the organizations that were directly working with these things hadn't put 2 and 2 together to think, that's there. So, for me, it's just, brilliant, if all of these things could come much more into the public domain, and how do we all work more together about that? Because it is so important. And, it was interesting, and in terms of what you're saying, Zoe, as an example of, data and all of that, there's masses there. There's lots of people doing stuff, like the Scientists for Global Responsibilities do some brilliant stuff, Brown's University, etc. But again, it doesn't, I think because it's such a vast subject and it touches on every single aspect of everything that happens, that it's really difficult to have those conversations. So how do we make it so people don't just go, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with this. And the sort of, so it'd be, I mean, for me, it's sort of exciting to, you know, how do we actually get those conversations, and then how do we work to actually get people to make those changes? Because as you say, it's every individual, isn't it? But, and also what you're saying about, you know, it's almost that we're setting up systems with the security governance and everything for conflict. I mean, for me, an example is like the arms trade, as for example. Everything, you know, our economies, global economies, particularly of the Western world, are around, you know, say, an arms trade. Well, if you have arms, you're going to use them. I mean, why are we developing these things to get better and better ways of destroying the planet rather than actually more and more in terms of how do we make a sustainable future for ourselves? And an example, a friend of mine, very recently, she's an engineer, and she was trying to apply for a job in the sustainable thing, change jobs. Every single job she was particularly looking at in the last 2 months was in the defense industry. I mean, it's madness. It's absolute madness. The best brains in, you know, in here, the creativity, the innovation, to go into destructive and unbelievably destructive stuff. It's like, you know, it's sort of, where's the humanity in that? It's sort of, it's become so unreal, all of this. And so it'd be fantastic, I think, if we could just try and bring back that humanity into what we are doing and how we are creating, as you say, a world that almost guarantees that we're going to go down that path, and making it incredibly difficult for other solutions to get any credence or, you know, sort of, because that's constantly put aside and not resourced. You know, the UN not resourced, for example. So, yeah, I find it really exciting to then have this opportunity to talk with people who I wouldn't have otherwise. So,
can I just
please
build on that as well? I think, you know, it's a really inspiring perspective to have, but I think it speaks to us also about the hope, the emotional, psychological reaction to what's happening to us and the planet. I mean, if you're anything like me, I'm just getting so depressed. You know, on the Twitter feed every morning, just looking at what is happening, you feel every day just that little bit more disempowered, that sense of a loss of hope. And I think what you're also speaking to is obviously the complexity of what we're dealing with, which leads to that sense of inability to deal with the challenges in isolation. But it also speaks to the function of what we should be doing as a civic university, is also to try to bring that hope, to create channels of communication and dialogue through which we can, at the very least, find solidarity, that we can find solutions to local problems and build relationships through which we can articulate. So it's a sense, Godfrey, you're talking about a loss of identity. For me, that's also, in a sense, about a feeling of disempowerment, moving into an environment. Again, I think identity politics and the concept of identity is central to this. But I think it's not perhaps so much a loss of identity, because, of course, they are also confronted with the imposition of a new stigmatized identity of the migrant, the refugee. And you know, on the radio, there's all this talk of how the migrant is some kind of problem to us. So, you know, all the way through this is woven the psychological and the sense of empowerment and the sense of our civic responsibility to find channels of resistance, to articulate an understanding, find solutions, and find a way of coming together to try to address things.
Yeah, Tom, and then I'll move to the audience for questions.
Yeah, just speak on that hope a bit more, because I've seen it, especially after COVID, you know, people losing that inner flame for the social movements, the environmental movements that they've been a part of. Just the other day, we were at Jonathan Port's final talk as Chancellor, and someone in the audience was speaking on how they've just lost that flame, their hope. They don't have any more energy to fight anymore. And I think coming out of COVID, a lot of people feel the same way. But that's just an opportunity to reignite that flame, you know? And I've been thinking about that immensely over the past year in this role. How are we going to reignite that flame in students, in our staff body, in the local community? And how are we going to build this movement back up, both in the environment and the social sector, to create peace and stop conflicts? And it really is an interesting part of the job role that I do and that we all do, that we all study, is trying to reignite that fire. And I'm really hopeful for next year. We're going to get a lot of new students at Kiel who have not experienced COVID-19 during as a student in university, and they're going to bring that fire back into the university. I can feel it, and I'm ready for that movement to come back up and for people to get involved and engaged. And that's how I keep my own hope up, is because other people inspire me to keep it going. And I think that even though, it's depressing and the world's, going downhill a bit with the environment and conflicts worldwide, if we stay hopeful as individuals and as a movement, a student movement, a staff movement, and a community movement, that's where I find my hope, and that's where I think change will come in the end.
Thanks, Tom. Very uplifting. Time is marching on, but I do want to give the audience time to ask questions. And Kerry has a roving mic and also able to see if there's any questions from people online. So does anyone want to pose questions for either individuals on the panel or the panel generally? Go on, Richard. You're on camera, Kerry.
First of all, can I start by thanking everyone for what's been one of the most broad-ranging and thought-provoking discussions I've been to for a long while. And I guess we all share that sort of sense of it can be difficult to kind of maintain that sort of sense of hope in view of the kind of the challenges we've been talking about. But focusing on that, I was just trying to think that, it's frequently, I guess, in conflict situations and when, individually or collectively people's backs are against the wall, that you can end up seeing some real positive developments in society. And I remember Cliffy giving a talk, during the course of the pandemic, and that sort of sense that, there's great sense of sort of social cohesion, that sense of, people were suddenly acting in a way, very rationally, and acting in ways that was almost kind of unexpected by those people who are trying to kind of predict what those behaviours would look like. So in trying to kind of reflect on a positive vision for the future, I was just wondering if there is that sort of moment of clarity in the recognition of the challenges posed by climate change, whether there is that possibility that will give society in general across the planet that sort of sense of that, that clear sense of purpose and that need to pull together in order to address those wide-ranging and existential challenges which are kind of posed by climate. I mean, is that a bit of a pipe dream in that sense? But I'm just sort of thinking that we can't really think of any more wide-ranging and dramatic impacts than sort of like climate change and the apocalyptic visions over the course of the next few decades. So just with that same vein, when people kind of appreciate that, whether there might be that opportunity for people really to pull together in the way that they have done historically, but on an even grander scale to deal with the challenges it poses.
Thank you, Richard. So who would like to take that one?
I can,
please start off.
There's certainly, yes, I think you're absolutely right to draw on that issue. And Tom, I think you touched on it as a case study example of what we find through studying the psychology of massive urgencies, is that we get that psychology wrong. Because actually the natural tendency in these kinds of situations is for people to overwhelmingly try to help each other, even to the point it becomes pathological. Because you're trying to help, and what you've got is this room full of stuff that becomes itself a logistic. How on earth am I going to get this to Ukraine? It's kind of an inability on our part to harness the natural tendencies of what happens to people when they're confronted with a collective threat, as we were in the pandemic. So think back to that first lockdown, and think back to the solidarity that we found, that sense of togetherness back in our front gardens with the sun shining, and the neighbours we'd not spoken to for decades suddenly walk past and we're having a conversation with them because we're all in it together. And that was the psychology through which we were able to engineer some kind of radical solution to these extraordinary circumstances. But it's juxtaposed with this really powerful ideological project that ends up with a narrative where we become more interested in a court case about social media and twittering between Vardy and Rooney than we are about the fact that our planet is being destroyed. So there's an ideological project at work that prevents us from thinking about ourselves as together, because there is a vested interest in constructing otherness. And it's that otherness that is actually toxic. Toxic, but serves the interests of particular political projects, which for some reason millions of people in this country and worldwide are buying into, that takes us away from a capacity to mobilise some form of collective solution. So there's the challenge on the table that we need to try and confront. But again, it brings us back to the central role that our thinking about human psychology must play in any debate about resilience and our capacity to bring about some kind of solution. Psychology is part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution if we understand how to harness that natural tendency that we actually have to find solidarity in one another. And in actual fact, in some sense, the solidarity we're finding here this evening by having this conversation.
Thanks, Cliff. Does anyone else want to add anything to that response?
Whether it's sort of thing, and it's no solution to this, but there was one example, just thinking about how we get everyone to come together, and absolutely, you know, we're so tribal, aren't we, in so many ways. But there was different, it's about non-violent action, I suppose, in anything. But there was one of the, right at the beginning of the invasion into Ukraine, the villagers would just stand, everyone would just stand in front of the tanks, you know, not armed, just stand there. And, you know, the whole village would just stand there. And that, you know, my personal instinct was, oh, please, if the whole world would just go there, just, you know, from all over, if we could just go and we just stand, you know, just stand and say, okay, run us over, keep, you know, people can't keep doing it, can they? They can't keep killing, you know, or doing something. But how on earth one harnesses that, I don't know, but I think it would work. But it's a really difficult one. How do we bring our others all together, and so we're not, yeah. But I think somehow we've all got to get together to react in a way that isn't expected of how a conflict situation demands of us, which is you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. No, I'm not going to, you know. But whoa, it's a difficult one.
I was wanting to pick up about technology advances a little bit, and you know, you look at past military advances, and you know, a lot of it's not been good, obviously. But there has been technology advances. You think about, I don't know, air travel. Again, not great for the planet, but it really progressed in the First World War. And it's interesting how climate change isn't in that sort of conflict theatre, because when you get to those sort of states, people think, right, what am I going to do? So there's all sorts of theories about global engineering, isn't there, Rich? Talking a bit about putting massive, you know, reflective things in space, and will that reduce the amount of sunlight coming into us? But or seeding the clouds and those sort of issues, but there doesn't seem that urgency of, you know, this is a big existential problem for us all. How are we going to solve this? And so look at some of the other countries' policies are pinning their hopes on some engineering that hasn't been invented yet. But then where's the driver for that? And of course, at the minute, it's all, as you mentioned, on armaments and defence and security, rather than climate change issues and sustainability, which is, you argue, is more the priority. But no solutions, but just thought I'd comment on that.
So no solutions, but my final question is going to be about solutions, because I'm a very solution-orientated person. So, would anyone like to expand on what their discipline or organisation, or us all as individuals, can do to actually start to address some of the issues that we've addressed this evening? So choose your scale of response. Now, we've touched on maybe a few things, but discipline, organisation, or us all as individuals?
I'm happy to go. Let me have a go.
Go on.
So I think that the thing is, let's try to recognise that we can't change everything, but there are some things that we can change. So let's focus locally in front of us what we can change. And I think, you know, we need as academics to recognise that there are certain responsibilities that we have to change the things around us that we can change. And I think the thing that we can change is the function of this university. And this event is, in a sense, part and parcel of that. It's that connection between your arts has created an opportunity for us to talk about conflict and sustainability, and through that to have a dialogue through which we connect with our audience here tonight and create a voice that builds awareness that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to drive forward with that and to recognise that, you know, universities aren't just about producing students as part of this neoliberal project, right? It's about funding areas of theorisation and discussion that are not, in a sense, commercially viable, but have a tremendous civic value, and recognise and fight back to protect the civic values of an institution like ours.
Thank you, Cliff. Very well put. Does anyone else want to add to that? Go for it, Tom.
Yeah, and I totally agree. As an institution, we need to take action, because universities are actually really powerful bodies, especially in the local and national sense. And as I touched on earlier, we're an international university. Most universities have a massive international community. So really, we are international. And it's to really make that impactful change. I do agree, sure, maybe I won't be, or we won't be the sole solvers of climate change, but we can do what needs to be done in the local area and nationally. I encourage students, staff, and the local and community to get involved with local movements relating to social injustices as well as environmental injustices, from climate strikes to strikes against the new police bill, for example. Anything it is to show your voice and share with the government that this is not okay and that we need to change. We need to continue working with our local community organizations, such as ASHA, to make sure that they are supported, whether that's supplying volunteers or raising money, as we did today with our student societies and student groups. Taking action locally, I think, is one of the major things that you can do. It is so satisfying, as well as so impactful. Sure, it's not an international impact, but those individual lives that you can make just a little bit better is the best thing you can do. And that's where I also drive my inspiration from and motivation, because it is so inspiring and so motivational to see the impact you have on just an individual. If we just raised £10 today, I still would have been happy, because that is still an impact. How small an impact is still a big impact in my mind. Whether your movement has 3 people in it or thousands, doesn't matter. It's that you're there and fighting for a cause. And I think that's what you can do as individuals, as groups, staff, local community, and students can do to make an impact.
Thank you, Tom. And I think that is probably a very good place to bring the discussions to a close. So before we finish, I would just like to encourage everybody to put time in their diaries to view Ali's Art for Peace exhibition, both at Keele and in Newcastle. So different parts of the exhibition are going to be in different places at different times, so check the website. But at the moment at Keele, there's parts of the exhibition in the Chancellor's Building Art Gallery and in Chapters Cafe, and there will be bits in Newcastle as well. So there's things that, have really struck me through this discussion. So, I think it was you, Ali, who was talking about, the need to bring humanity into how we think about things. Thought about the universities, as places where we can bring and reignite hope and be channels of communication and collaboration for these causes, and areas where we can channel resistance as well. So I actually feel incredibly uplifted from this discussion, despite the somewhat depressing context of it. But actually that thread of hope has really sort of run throughout. So the final thing that falls to me is to thank our excellent panelists and our wonderful audience and those online. And so thank you all.